helping with the land as well, and buying stamps too. If you buy stamps, then you would help pay for the war effort in Egypt. In Egypt, Samir, the one we saw before, a magazine, which was a state-run comics magazine, featured comics depicting lessons in popular resistance. So they had Durus al-Muqawama, Shabiya upstairs, so you would even have a lesson on how to work on your resistance. And it promoted the soldier, of course, as a national hero. This was imitated in Syria also by Osama in 1969, in Iraq by Majallati and Mizmar. On the cover of Syria, the Syrian comics magazine was Osama. It was state-run, and of course this is during the war as well. I think that's the 73 war though. Okay, I'm just going to talk something here about language. The ideal of Arab nationalism affected every aspect in the comics, particularly the use of literary or classical Arabic. So here al-Fusha, in the juvenile magazines, as opposed to the colloquial dialect that they used to use in some of the comics in Egypt. So the classical Arabic was enforced as it was considered the language of the Arab nation as a whole, and using the local dialect was a sign of disunity. This was enforced the principle that the strength of the Arab lies in their unity. So even if the colloquial Arabic was at times used in Samir, and here we have a sample of, you know, so this is Egyptian. When it was stories pertaining to the Arab history or something more serious, then it was always in classical Arabic. So these are written in classical Arabic, as most of the comics was at the time. But in Egypt, they did have colloquial or with the Egyptian dialect. Here we're going to be talking about the Ba'ath sentiments. So we're in Iraq now. This is Al-Mizmar. Majallat al-Mizmar from Iraq. The magazines Osama, which was in Syria, and Mizmar and Majallati, which were in Iraq, they upheld the socialist values of the Ba'ath regime in Syria and Iraq, such as Arab nationalism, patriotism, militarism, secularism, and the worship of science and productivity. And this was very important in all their magazines. They produce, they're building, they're constructing, they're farming, and this was a big part of their ideals. Farmers and soldiers were prominently featured inside and on the covers of them as well. And here it's in Majallati, in Al-Mizmar, in Iraq, 1979, we can see also that they have the national costume, so they're wearing them from their heritage, as well as they're going further back to Mesopotamia, as far back in their history, so they're, you know, honoring the history as well as their local heritage, which was not, I mean, you know, they weren't trying to look fashionable or to look Western, they were honoring that aspect of them. And here we have on the cover, of course, the soldier with the nice rockets behind him. And of course, don't forget, these are all children's magazines. I think people coming from Arab countries are not surprised because we're used to this in Adi, but it's not Adi, just so you know. Images of children looking up to the leader of the nation as a father figure in Al-Tali'a, pioneer, so we have Hafs al-Assad here, reinforced the notion of the state. And here we have Majallati, Muhammad Hassan al-Bakr, who is the Iraqi president at the time. So Majallati has, for now we'll see all of them. Oh, I'll go to the covers later on. Interestingly, women don't feature prominently, actually featured very prominently in the earlier stages of the regime, 1970s. They took part of, this isn't a clear one, but they took part of the revolution. Majallati issued a whole series, which was an Iraqi Ministry of Culture and the Arts. They featured a long-running series entitled Occupation, where the women were the instigators of the revolution. So early in the history of the Ba'ath and so on in the 70s, the women were featuring prominently in the comics as people who were played a big part of these revolutions or these changes, but later on they disappeared, of course. While Majallati stressed modernization and de-emphasized religion, which is very important, in other parts of the Arab world, the religion featured prominently, so Islam. But in the Ba'ath countries such as Iraq and Syria, of course, it was much more, had an image of secularism to it. So it also fostered tradition, local culture, and appealing to the past glories of Iraq, all of which represented Ba'athist sentiments. Tales depicting the Mesopotamian Empire in Al-Mizmar, 1970s, highlighting the local heritage, were followed in the next chapter by science fiction stories in space, emphasizing modernization and the role of science. So you always had to have a story about Fada or space and so on. And you also had interesting stories of Mesopotamia and their old writing and so on. And of course, they were all done in comics format. Aware of this immense impact of comics in the of these popular media and the comics, Syria went as far as banning all other Arab comics and ensured a complete image monopoly, as well as preventing other ideologies from influencing the people. So Syria had only Osama and didn't allow any of the other comics into their country. None from Iraq, none from Egypt, none from the United Arab Emirates. So the kids in Syria saw Osama. Okay, Nasserite politics. Majid was very important. The United Arab Emirates witnessed the birth and later hegemony of the comics magazine Majid. It is during the 80s. It was actually published first in 1979 by the Ministry of Information of Abu Dhabi. The journal was the work of prominent artists and intellectuals of the region at the time, collaborating together to serve the pan-Arab ideology. They were distanced from their regime, so they left their countries. They were opposing what was going on in their own countries. They distanced themselves from the regimes of their homelands, led by the Egyptian Nasserite journalist Ahmad Omar. It was published in the Gulf, away from the control of the Sadat rule in Egypt. Syria's Ali Farzad, Egypt's Adli Rizallah, Hijazi, Muhyiddin Labad were all leading artists, writers, journalists of the time who contributed to the political line of the magazine. Of course, common themes of Arab solidarity, imperialism, and Zionism were presented in Majid, along with the respect for Islam as the local heritage and as the continuing moral basis for social life. So as opposed to the Ba'athist ones, these had much more anti-Zionism and the representation of Islam as a moral base for the social life. So this pan-Arabism, in addition to the use of more universal literary Arabic, so the classical Arabic, in place of the local dialects, promoted a region-wide distribution while permitting unique and indigenous production. So Majid was only in classical Arabic, no dialect, and this was on purpose so that all the Arab countries could be able to, all the children in the Arab countries could be reading these comics. Political issues were introduced as well through the integration of local and regional concerns, while relating adult politics to the realities of the children. So this not only stimulated patriotic pride, but also evoked the Palestinian cause. In one of the main series in the journal, the female character, Zakiya, which is Zakiya the Intelligent, she introduced her young readers, and this was very unusual, to have a leading character that was a female, but it was wonderful. Of course she has big glasses to show that she's smart. And so she introduced issues of politics, science, religion, as well as presenting information on Arabic culture and traditions through storytelling and recollection. She's talking about the Ku Klux Klan. She talks about the different situations that happened with the Israelis. So it was, interesting stuff. Interestingly, the photography was used in this series with the ideological purpose of creating a second level of proof. The drawn figures were thereby the storytelling, and they were the fiction, and the photography referred to the real. So this was one of their techniques, and this effective technique was particularly useful in propagating the political ideals of the magazine. This also made it seem very serious, so the kids would take it that, oh, it really happened. And so here we're talking about how they treat the African Americans, blacks at that time in America. The cult of the Zani. The ever-present icon of the leaguer in contemporary Arab world, I think we're all used to it, manifests the rule and creates the legitimacy. Portraits and images of the leaders of the totalitarian regimes in the region are commonly displayed all over the place, on the walls, on posters, on book covers, as well, of course, on television. The medium of comics hasn't escaped this phenomenon, with most of the leaders, of course, have appeared on the covers and the insides of the publications of children's comics magazines at the time. So on Majalati, we have Muhammad Hassan Bakr of Iraq. He graced the cover of Majalati 1971. Nasser of Egypt was on the cover of Samir in the 70s, and this was a series when they covered his life from when he was young and then when he was older and eldest. So this was number 3, let's say, but it was a whole series on Jamal Nasser's life. Bashar al-Assad of Syria is on the cover of Osama. This is a 2007, so it's a later one. Sheikh Zayed featured on Majid, as well as King Abdullah of Jordan. He's playing up there in Al-Hadiqa, in the magazine, the Jordanian state magazine. So all the leaders are in the comics and on the covers, on the boat. And this is normal, again. You have to understand that in the Arab world we consider this as Ali. You missed something? No. Okay, comic books devoted to the biographies of a number of those leaders were commissioned during the early 80s and displaying political manifestations of the medium. We have Jamal Abdel Nasser, we have Gaddafi, and we have Saddam Hussein. They all have comics magazines, comics books, entire album about them. So the Egyptian Ray Abdel Nasser and the former Iraqi Zaim Saddam Hussein and of course, Colonel Gaddafi, each issued a biographical comics to their name. This comes as no surprise, as the 3 rulers of us cultivated and secured their power as cult Zaim leaders and use of mass media, which did not exclude their comics. So they used standard propaganda techniques. The comic books portrays their humble beginnings, so they always come from simple beginnings. Here, of course, it is Gaddafi who comes here, he's a Bedouin. So either a low-income farmer or a Bedouin. Their existence is being from the people and for the people. They struggle for the common good. Their rise to power elevated them to the status of top revolutionary leaders in the world. And this is translated, by the way. It is in Arabic as well. Rooted in the history of the collective memory of their country, they always have generalities, generic terms of freedom, democracy, glory are repeated continuously throughout the albums. The 3 books glorify their lives and present their idealistic goals. Gaddafi is the hero of this book, which is called The History of the Libyan Revolution, Once Upon a Time Gaddafi, 1980s. And it starts in 1200. So it goes that far back. Gaddafi's, anyway, and is portrayed as the new spiritual leader of the revolution, with the primary crusader for Arab unity, Palestinian freedom, independence from Western hegemony. The narrative of the book employs, of course, sweeping sentiments with notions of glory, honor, etc., love of country, freedom, and it shows his speeches through the general narration. Of course, there's an album by about Jamal Abdel Nasser, and it represents the leader's life story with full historical context, so it's placed in the context. It celebrates Nasser's legendary speeches, as we often see Nasser addressing his people as well as other Arab audiences. He's always talking to his audiences, which was what he was famous for. It stresses the oral communication as a populist vehicle for his messages. It's notable that the first 2 comics were illustrated by European artists and were translated to several languages, so they were commissioned not by their own artists, except Saddam Hussein, who had an Iraqi artist do his. The only album to be produced locally, they did have good artists, excellent artists actually. So this was called The Long Days. It's a fictional piece. It's not portrayed as real, but it tells his life story supposedly. It illustrates the life of Saddam Hussein based on true events. Important changes are depicted not in the life of the nation, but in that of the hero. The Iraqi leader's life is relegated to that of a myth Islamic references and symbols are absent completely. There are no mosques, no backgrounds with, there's no iconic representation of Islam. The comic album keeps with the myth of Saddam on a secular level, in concordance with the Ba'ath. Unfortunately, in both books, women do not appear to construct any part of the, or to participate in these revolutions and ideas. They are only presented at times to support the statements made. The women are the prototypical victims, and the sobbing widow personifies the tragic Arab-Israeli war in Nasser. The only time in Nasser that women appear is one image, and she's crying, and that's it. Even in the audiences or the people that he's addressing his mind. So a traditional appeal to protect her from the indignity and suffering at the hands of the foreigner. Women appear only in one instance in once upon a time Gaddafi, where Gaddafi is addressing the nation in a speech, and he mentions the important role of women in construction of the country. They are depicted standing in the foreground listening to the speech, over here, the three women, and do not appear again in the entire book. Their recognition and representation seems to be just an afterthought. So you have women there, and that's it, an entire album that's 80 or 100 pages. And that's strange, because really at that time there was a lot of working towards women's rights, and women were featuring in Ba'ath countries in the ministries, they were in political positions as well as, so anyway, I do think that because those two happen to be illustrated by foreigners, might have been, I don't know. Okay, religious comics. So when we're talking about propaganda, we're going to cover religious comics as well, because propaganda happens in different places as well. So besides the governmental institutions, religious associations also took advantage of the potential of comics as a vehicle for propagating their ideas. Both the state-owned and the private associations found a way to disseminate their message, some indirectly and discreetly, and some very, very directly. So with the decline of Arab nationalism model and the rise of political Islam, especially after September 11, the region witnessed the spread of comic publications with increased Islamic content. We have here, of course, not just Islamic. The restricted layouts and conventional formats of these so directed they had very restricted layouts. They were very, like, every square follows the next one. It ensured reception of a wider audience, but it also lent itself to the seriousness of the subject. However, this format was less engaging and tended to be dull and preachy, and doubtful as to the extent of the genre's effectiveness. Okay. There are very few that were religious comics magazines that were addressing Christian audience or about Christians, but I'd like to cover some of the very political ones before I go to the Islamic, because they were there as well. Here we have the Qissat al-Mawarli, Maroon, and it is Lebanon 1979, and it's the history of the Maronites. Published by the Department of History in the Jamaat al-Tasliq, I think. It was an exception in the vast landscape of Muslim magazines produced at the time. It depicted the history of the Maronite Christians, a minority at the time, and they were holding the ruling power, their struggle against the Islamic invasion and of their Lebanese territory. Although the album may be considered historical documentation, its conception during the sectarian civil war, it was in the 80s, gave it a very political weight. Furthermore, the comics was written in colloquial Arabic, so al-Ammi. It was not in classical Arabic, and this was, of course, on purpose. It reflected the Maronite ideology, allocating Lebanese roots to the Phoenicians while denying their Arabian descent. The local dialect made it text easily accessible, aiding the reader in identifying with their point of view and propagating their message. I think here is they're depicting the Islamic invasion coming. This was also the case of Hikayat Batal Ismahu Sharbil, the story of a Maronite hero, which of course covers Bashir Ismail. It tells the story of a protagonist who sacrificed his life to protect the land and the faith. At one point, the young warrior recounts the story of the Lebanese president, Bashir Ismail, whose father was, of course, the leader of the political party. The comics upholds the Maronite ideology, propagates their cult leader in direct and clear terms, and it's not subtle at all. It was featured in the political party magazines, so it was distributed only to active members. So it remained very limited in the area of Christian subordination and did not go beyond the Lebanese borders. So this one did not have any, it did not go beyond Lebanon. This was not distributed in the Arab countries. But it's a long comic about Bashir Ismail and his speeches and everything. Okay, politicized Islamic comics from moderate to the radical. So we'll start with the moderate Islamic and then we'll go more radical. Comics with an Islamic and Arab inclination began timidly in the 1970s. Published or sponsored by the state, the juvenile comics magazines Bara'am al-Iman in Kuwait, Al-Muslim al-Saghir in Egypt, and Urfana was in Tunis, Al-Hadiqa in Jordan, are all similar in form and purpose. To spread the Islamic religion. That was their purpose. They were also similar in their conformism and self-paced limitations. They always have square, 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 square. I mean, it's very Muslim, organized. The religious messages were presented in straightforward fashion. The Palestinian cause, of course, is always omnipresent and constantly referenced as well. So we always have Palestine featured, and the cause is high on the agenda. I'll just go quickly over some of those. From the feature stories to the fixed sections to the crossword puzzles, Islamic education was the main theme throughout these two journals. Bara'am al-Iman was a supplement of the Ministry of Waqf, Islamic Affairs in Kuwait, and the Firdaus was published by the High Council of Islamic Affairs and Department of Ministry of Pious Affairs in Egypt. So these are state-run comics magazines. I'm not showing only the comics, also that they have stories like Rihla ila Bayt Allah or crossword puzzles, etc. In Al-Hadiqa, the Jordanian state magazine with also Islamic orientation, different issues, it differed in the use of the Jordanian or Palestinian dialect to represent the bad characters. And the classical Arabic was used for the good characters. That was strange. So when the boy is being bad, he speaks the dialect of the Jordanian dialect, and when the policeman comes, he speaks in classical Arabic. But here he's explaining about the Red Crescent and the Red Cross and the differences between the symbolism of why the Arab world has the crescent, not the cross. So, and then of course it ends with, we hope that Palestine will be free. No, he's hoping that they're, yes, anyway. The expansion of children's Islamic periodicals that were published by independent and non-governmental Islamic associations appeared in the 80s with the publication of Muslim al-Saghir and in Egypt, and Ahmad, which is still running in Lebanon from 1987. The latter, Ahmad, was aimed at a Muslim generation, ila Jil Muslim, with primarily educational, which was mostly educational, while upholding Islamic moral values. So it was much more about education. But as you can see on the cover, so it still was heavily Islamic as a magazine. The comics featured sections and series covering religious themes from historical to fictional and to daily Islamic practices. So how to pray, not to steal, but also stories about famous characters from the historical past. After September 11, 2001, various efforts were made in an attempt to portray a more moderate and forgiving face of Islam. One such effort emerged as a serial comics magazine entitled The 99. It was created by Naif Mutawar, a Kuwaiti businessman and psychologist, and it was based on the 99 names of God. Each, which is a virtue. The magazine was inspired by Muslim faith and culture with no direct allusion to religion in the stories. So it's based on different stories, but it doesn't directly allude to it. It was drawn by accomplished American superhero artists from DC and Marvel magazines. The 99 characters must overcome their obstacles through cooperation and unity, featuring weapon-free powers drawn from their virtues to fight the evil. So no weapons, only their virtues should rule. They created it was created in the style of American superheroes, muscular, etc. The series, which was translated to many languages, Chinese, English, etc., is an appealing adventure for teenage kids across the world, and it was meant to introduce them to a more moderate version of Islam. Not all the characters are Muslim in the books. They are notably, many of the female characters are not veiled, and thereby making them also more accessible to a foreign audience. So it was conceived in the Arab world and in Kuwait, but it was really meant also for the Arab world to be proud of their heritage or their background, and the foreigners to understand or to have a different look at Islam. The recent spread of Islamic comics is relatively surprising. With an Islamic intolerance usually vis-à-vis the illustrated image, the recent religious revival was expected to bring along a decrease in comics, where it's known in Islam that they prefer not to depict the human being in illustration. So one would expect in comics that there would be a reduction. In fact, it was the religious institutions appropriated the cultural form rather than eliminating them. So we have, of course, Mahdi. On the other end of the moderate comics, we have the more radical and politicized comics that appeared. We have Al-Mahdi, which was 2002 started. It's a Lebanese juvenile publication, which, according to the cover, is a Boy Scout magazine. The title refers to the return of course, the Imam al-Mahdi in the Shiite ideology. The magazine is run by Hezbollah. It's sold, but also distributed in different areas. It has a defined audience, religious and political agenda, and is clearly a vehicle for their propaganda. They have dominant religious themes placed on the backgrounds of clouds and sunsets, portray characters with iconic poses and hand gestures, adding a holy appearance and affirming the religious righteousness of the comics, and most importantly, the cause. While the introductory pages are devoted to the words and advice of Iranian spiritual and political leaders, such as Imam Khomeini and Khamenei, they are faithfully illustrated, not comics, so they make them as more serious illustrations. The rest presents strips of adventures recounting exploits of the Islamic resistance against the Israeli aggressor. So we have a Colin Moore, and they're preparing for an attack on Israelis. And we have, of course, Nasrallah giving a speech here. And these are drawn, of course, by Lebanese artists, local, and the script is written here as well. This is produced in Lebanon. You can find this in any library, including on film. Stories of the Shiite religious history and series instructing in the readers how to follow Islamic discipline in daily life are part of the magazine. So you have historical or religious background, but you also have stories about how to deal with discipline in the daily life. Anything got to do with discipline in daily life is women. Everything else, the action and the figures are the men. This entices the young reader into an illustrated world full of excitement, adventure, leading up to clearly defined goals, paving the way in preparation for the appearance of the Mahdi and freeing the Palestine from the Israeli occupation. So that's just this magazine. The goals are clearly born. Of course, in the end, no Haber Palestine. Women rarely feature as part of the activism. They're often only included when discussing practical practices in Islam or representing moral guidance on light issues such as lying or cheating or boasting. Additionally, humor is almost completely non-existent in Islam. They're beautifully illustrated, they're professionally done. The comics is very well thought out. They're very engaging comics. Now we'll move to a little more fundamentalism in comics. Arabic comics with radical religious agenda have already made their way into the market. They're out there on the racks if you look. For instance, the monthly magazine Faris al-Ghad, this is published in Lebanon, 2006, openly propagates suicide bomber and martyrdom in the name of religion while targeting a very young audience. So here we have Abtal min Biladi, so heroes from my country, and it's about a grandmother who is getting ready to go and explode herself, and her grandson says, "Hani'an laki ya jaddati," something about that he will follow in her footsteps. So he congratulates her on her, and these are pieces of his grandmother. So the danger, I think, just lies in that these magazines, they understand the full potential of the medium, and so they do so using professional comics illustrators, trendy styles, exciting narratives, manga style, and they're far more engaging to the young audience than the very moderate Islamic ones. Here, of course, we have Hurub al-Salibiyya, so the historical background, and here we have an adventure. All adventures are only boys. No girls in any of the adventures. From humoristic, entertaining comics, so the tales of legendary fighters who died for their cause, the comics are smoothly woven into each other. It's difficult to see the difference between a story of, let's say, a picnic or a grandmother who's a suicide bomber. Really, with the state, there's just one more. This is on purpose black. With the state-owned magazines have gone into, so we really had, all these different countries had state-owned magazines. They are no longer run by the artists who are engaged and the intellectuals. The comics magazines of the past have been reduced to mediocrity in form and content. They're just remaining merely as hollow vessels of the tired regimes that created them. Perhaps, I think, the decline in the comics should have been a clear indication of the nearing end of these regimes. The current comics and publications that you find in on the market, they probably signify what's going to come. We have both commercial level comics, that is catering to today's children's needs, desires, entertainment, education, comedy, Egyptian, or more radical ones with imposing ideologies. So we have two extremes. We have the very radical, and then we have the very simply just entertaining. The moderate are less there. These are from the Egyptian Revolution, from Tok Tok magazine in Egypt, 2011. This is just when it was happening in the beginning. I think it'll be interesting to see what form of comics will evolve as a result of the Arab Spring. I don't like to call it that anymore. And the collapse of the totalitarian regimes with such an extensive history of visual communication and propaganda in its wake. Egypt, Tok Tok, talking about the revolution. Syria with the torturing in, this is very recent, so 2013. Syria also, 2013. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm
قبل ما أطرح سؤالي أود أن أبين يعني تصحيح الرئيس العراقي اللي يظهر بمجلة المزمار هو مش محمد حسن البكر، هو أحمد حسن البكر. هذا الموضوع الثاني اللي أثار انتباهي حقيقة هو موضوعات أن يعني تفجر المرأة نفسها وتنقل تلك القضية إلى الأطفال عن طريق رسائل مصورة. برأيك يعني هل من الصحيح يعني أن لا نتصدى لذلك؟ هل هذه يعني هي نعم دعاية، طريقة لتوصيل فكرة ووسائل إلى الأطفال، وقد يتبعهم الأطفال في ذلك مستقبلا لأنها عملية زرع أفكار، وهذه رسائل اتصالية يعني هي جزء من التنشئة الاجتماعية للطفل. ما الذي علينا أو ما هو دور التربية الإعلامية الرقمية في معالجة تلك الحالة؟
هلا أنا أول شيء ما بدي أحكم عليه، يعني أنا مش وضعي إنه أنا يقرر شو لازم يعمل، انا عم فرجيك انا عم فرجي شو موجود بالسوق. عم ينسمع، انا عم فرجيك شو موجود، واكيد عم بتمنى انه تشوف انه اكيد هن قصدهم ياثروا بالاطفال ويربوا جيل يتعود على هالشيء ويفكر انه خلص هذا موجود بذهنه بيربى معه، يعني اكيد حيتقبلوا اكثر اذا كان عم يشوفوا بالكومنتس. انا معك، يعني ممكن يكون رايي الخاص انه بطريقتي الخاصه ممكن انا اعمل شيء بس انت انا اللي علي انه افرجيك هذا موجود، انت شو بدك تعمل؟
يعني المفروض لازم نحلل احنا اليوم طبعا هذا هيك جلسه لازم نحلل هاي الابعاد.
انا اجدها خطيره، يعني على بس موجوده ولازم الواحد يعرف انه موجوده وانه شو حتعملوا انتم بهالموضوع، يعني مش بس انا، مش دوري انا برسم.
يعني هو دور الجده اليوم هي ليست مغامره للاطفال تقدم للاطفال. دور الجده ليست مغامره اليوم، عمليه انسان يفجر حاله، يعني هي مغامره تفجر حال.
انا ما رسمت الموضوع يا اخي. انا عم فرجيك انه في اتجاهين لازم بالكومنتس في هذا اليوم، في يعني وعم نحكي طبعا عن بروباغندا، يعني عم فرجيك انه هدول الناس عم يربوا الاطفال على رؤيه معينه او على ايديولوجي معين، وهذا طبعا يعني شو الحدود؟ امتى بتقول صح او غلط؟ امتى لازم يوقف؟ في جزء منه تربيه وفي جزء منه انه طبعا عم توجه الاطفال، هذا شيء خطير، بس لازم يعني مين قرا الكومنتس؟ مين منكم عارف فيهم؟ مين عم يشوفهم؟ منيح، 1 2 3 عظيم. شو رايكم فيه؟
أنا بعتقد إن هاي الرسائل ما رح توقف، رح تضلها مستمرة ولها تأثير كثير كبير خصوصاً على الصغار، يعني الرسومات جاذبة حلوة، يعني الكاريكاتير كثير حلوة. فبعتقد إنه الحل الوحيد إنه نرسم نعمل كاريكاتير مضاد صح بأسلوب حلو، بهزل يكون أكثر، مش هيك رسائل هذا شيء.
أنا أول شيء المباشر طلع، يعني أول سؤال سألوني إياه بمحاضرة برا، إنه طيب إذا هالقد موجود بكل المجلات وبالكتب وبالاعلانات، الولد ما بصير اميون تو، يعني ما بيتاثر خلص؟ ما بعرف، هذا سؤال للعالم العربي، يعني نحن بينا بهالجو. هل نحن بعدنا انه بس نشوفهم ولا لا عم تاثر فينا كاطفال؟ باللاوعي. انا برايي مثلك انه الواحد لازم يعمل المضاد، ما في شيء، انا ما ضد منع الاشياء، لا بدي حدا يمنعني ولا بدي انا امنع حدا.
اعتقد انه لازم نعطيهم حريه هم يشوفوا ويفكروا.
صح. هلا كثير من هالمجالات تتوزع، يعني اللي فيها طاغي جو سياسي او اسلامي مور اكستريم تتوزع مش بس تنباع، سو في الاودينس تبعها ممكن يكون منقى.
First of all, I would like to comment on Mahdi magazine because I personally wrote an article about it in the blog. I work at a library, so I received the magazine and made sure to return it, so you're not going to find it in Virgin Megastore. So the thing that touched me with it, not just about the comics and the adventures of the resistance fighter and so on, there's another part. This version of the magazine is made for 4-year-olds to 7-year-olds. And the graphics that were included, you know the game, the maze and so on, the maze was riddled with landmines. And also there was another part where you have to pick out what equipment would the resistance fighter use in the front line. And then I checked out another magazine, Basa magazine, which you also mentioned, from Saudi Arabia. And both magazines, there's something that's extremely, I think, provocative about them. Apart from the absence, or the general absence of women, there's no contact between men and women. Like you don't even see a husband and wife talking to each other. But on the other side as well, there's no answer to these magazines or to these comics. Like with Lebanese artists, for example, we have Samandal, we have Zina Comics, we have a couple of initiatives, but they're not answering this phenomenon. I think that's extremely dangerous. We don't have children magazines, local children magazines in Arabic, which answer this phenomenon.
I think there were a few moderate ones, like in Egypt they have children's magazines that are, I don't know if you can say they answer this phenomena, but they at least cater to entertainment, and it's not light. I mean, entertainment at all levels is educational. I don't think anything isn't that. Almost all these magazines are infused with education because the parents won't buy them unless they have these educational things. But Egypt does. I think here there was an attempt to start a more typical comics magazine. We don't have support in there, but I mean these are funded by their institutions, so it's easier for them to have them done. So we need secular institutions to fund comics magazines, perhaps to help have a balance. And we have a Samandal member here, so if you want to ask, he can answer. Yes.
Now, talking about this academically, I find it quite interesting. When I was the age of many people in this room, we used to read a lot of comics that were printed during the Second World War or maybe a little later, where it was okay to blow up a Nazi institution and kill everybody. Or it was all about soldiers and there was never a woman in it. These were printed in the US, these were printed in Christian Europe, US, after the women's liberation, and yet we accept them and they're normal. And now we don't accept this because this is really in our back door. Right now it's really dangerous. But even today for us, if we read the others that do the exact same thing as this, but it's distant in time and in space, if you like, we accept it, it's fine.
Well, I beg to differ. As a woman, I didn't. But maybe you, as a young boy, may have found it fine.
Actually, I never noticed it until you mentioned it right now.
But it is true, and there is a big, I mean, there is a whole thing in the Western community about the lack of women in comics, whether artists drawing the comics or the people who are making the comics or being represented. So they were not represented totally. I very much agree with you, and it's, I guess, harder at our back door. I'll answer you, John, just a minute.
Then I want to just a commentary on what he said. What he's talking about in the Western comics, they were like exceptions, and they were not the mainstream comics that are entertaining, fun, adventures, whatever, etc. What you have here are mainstream comics that are Islamic, that are spreading this, glorifying the killing, the whatever, etc. And this is a huge difference. That's all.
Possibly. I also think that, I mean, everything, I don't also want to judge so much. I don't say this is bad or this is good, as much as this is the state of things that are now there. I'm afraid of the very fundamentalist, extremist things for sure, because I think this affects the young people no matter what. The Minds in the crossword puzzle, or the maze, the Minds in the maze is brilliant, although it is a fact of life to a lot of our young people. Not to place them there for, blowing someone up, but we do have a lot of people who are in the South where there's still even minds existing, and so maybe, I don't know.
But there's an emphasis on who planted them.
Yeah.
So the whole vilification.
Oh, I do know what you're talking about completely. And these are in all the bookstores you go to. I mean, I just said Antoine as a thing, but I mean, any bookshop or any place that sells magazines has all of these magazines that I'm talking about in their schedule. These are today, not old. I can't hear. Oh, sorry, I can't see.
بدي احكي هلا احنا بشكل عام الاعلام ما كان عمره محايد او حتى موضوعي، بالتالي كل مجله عم تعمل بروباغندا بتعمق رؤيتها وسياستها وفكرها. اللي بدي اساله هلا كل مجله عم تعطي معلومات كامله عم حتى تتيح للناس فرصه الاختيار الصح، ولا عم بتقدم معلومات ناقصه. الشيء الثاني عم بتخاطب ايش بالضبط، العقل ولا العاطفه؟
هلا بالرسم وهيك العاطفه انا بتصور. يعني هلا بيفسروا يعني المغامرات اللي عم تشوفيها او اول شيء انك تنقي الجده، يعني عم تخبري العاطفه، يعني هي سته قريبه ولبيت وبعدين التايتل العنوان هو ابطال من بلادي او ابطال يعني خلص انت عم تقولي لهم هي بطل ما عم تعطيهم اللي هن ينقوا هي عملت هالشغله شوفوا انتم هي بطله او لا، عم تقولوا لهم انه هي بطله صراحه. لا اتس وان سايدد اكيد. any propaganda برايي هي وان سايدد whether it is للدين او للسياسه او شيء حيفرجوك الشيء المنيح بهالموضوع، ما حيفرجوك the other side. You're here.
مرحبا. اولا تعليقا او تعقيبا على اللي قاله الاستاذ، يمكن الفرق انه ليش نجحت البروباغندا باوروبا او امريكا وقبلناها او اذا قبلناها، انا بقول انه لانه نجحت. نحن هون ما عم نقبلها لانه فشلت، ما عم نقول انه لازم نقبلها، not endorsing this. البروباغندا هي جزء من خطه عامه، يمكن خطه اعلاميه او استراتيجيه لبناء دوله او بناء مجتمع وتقدمه. نحن بالتوجه اصلا كرؤيه بمجتمعاتنا عربيه اسلاميه او عربيه علمانيه بين مزدوجين، ما عندنا خطه وما عندنا رؤيه لنقدر نستغل الادوات، اي ادوات كانت اعلاميه او لا لننجح. تاكيدا على هذا الموضوع، نحن بعد ما قدر يعني عم تحكي عن موضوع العلمانيه السكولر، كان بروباغندا او اعلام او الى ما هنالك. حتى وقتها كان في بروباغندا قوميه عربيه بمجله علي بابا عام 52 بمصر، الصوره اللي شفناها صوره عسكري على حصان معه رمح عم يقتل التنين. هيدي صوره مارجليس عم يقتل التنين، واللي هي كمان في صوره لبوتين رسمينه بروسيا مأهينه عم يقتل كمان التنين. فحتى عقليتنا نحن المنهجيه تبعنا طريقه تفكيرنا تفكير ديني. فبغض النظر قد ما تقدمنا وغيرنا من البروباغندا، اذا العقليه ما كانت عم تتطور، البروباغندا حتى لو كانت بشعه ما رح تنجح، مش عم بقول لازم تنجح. ومشان هيك البروباغندا اللي كثير بشعه بالمانيا النازيه نجحت.
هاي أملنا معوض. بدي أقول لك إنه أنا بشتغل بليلي أنطوان ونحن ما عنا إياه. أتليست إنه عندنا بالفرع، يعني ما بعرف بغير فروع، بس نحن ما عنا إياهم. وقصة المانجا
مش المهدي بنجيبه من هون. سوري انا المهدي بجيبه من انطوان. اتس اوكي ما شيء غلط. First of all انا بس بدي اقول شيء كثير مهم. انا ما عرضت هدول انه شيء غلط، ولا عرضت شيء انه هيدا ما منيح وهيدا منيح. في مجلات عم تروج للاسلام المودريت اللي يعني ما بيفرجوا شيء الا ديلي لايف وواحد ما يكذب. ما عم بقول هدول، عم بقول انه في هيدا موجود ولازم نعرف بوجودهم. واذا واحد بده يعمل بالمقابل مثل ما قالت حضرتها او قال حدا انه maybe we should balance.
بعد شغله كرمال البنت يعني بالكوميكس، ما بعرف انا عم بحكي كنت عن ماجازين او عن الكتب، بس بالكتب في قصص يعني كوميكس فيهم
طبعا انا بس عم بحكي عن المؤسسات الدوله والمؤسسات الدينيه اللي عملت كوميكس او الاحزاب. انا ما عم بحكي ابدا عن يعني ما غطيت طبعا انا ما غطيت الكوميكس اللي هي الانترتينمنت او comics albums. I didn't cover any of those. I only spoke about state-owned magazines and private institutions who have a political or religious agenda. بس بدي اقول شيء، يعني انا برايي بعد كل هالشغل اللي بشوفه، انا ربيت بالعالم العربي وسكنت باليمن وبمصر وبسوريا وببيروت وبالكويت وعشت يعني عادي كثير إلنا كعرب انه نشوف هالشيء، بالنسبه لنا كثير طبيعي. بس اذا بتفرجي اي حدا برا بينصدموا انه okay, it's very true. There were the Nazi kind. And they had Superman did the war effort too. يعني even there's a lot about that. But for it to be so blatant, يعني هالقد موجوده بالوجه، يعني مش انه مخفيه شوي او في شيء heroic، هذا اللي شوي surprising يعني. بس نحن عن جد متعودين بكل شيء، يعني دفاتري بسوريا كانوا عليهم البريزيدنت والكتب والمحايا والقلم وما بعرف شو، وقتها كان باليمن البريزيدنت طبعا على الحيط وعلى يعني معودين يعني. انا ماني مسؤوله، يعني اللي بده يحكي.
ماني هلا بموقع اقول اذا البروباغندا ناجحه او مش ناجحه، بس انا بدي انقل شغله صغيره حول موضوع البروباغندا. حزب الله في روايه الاطفال موجهه الى طفل او بطريقه اخرى. ما قبل حرب تموز اصدر حزب الله سلسله من الروايات وحضرتك عرضتيها، اللي كانت بتفرجي المقاوم في الجبهه وبتفرجي الام في المنطقه التي تنتظر المقاومه، ولكن ما بعد حرب تموز انا هون بس بدي اوصل مسج انه من يصنع البروباغندا يعني شو هي الاستراتيجيه اللي بده اياها عم يوصلها من خلال البروباغندا. اذا اجرينا مقارنه بسيطه ما بين قصه قبل وقصه بعد، انا قرات سلسله قصص ما بعد حرب تموز فوجدت انه حزب الله غير كثير بهذه البروباغندا، توجه الى الاطفال، صور لهم شهداء اطفال، صور هيدا الشهيد هو انجل، صور هيدا الشهيد من دون دم، هو مبتسم، هو شهيد بالجنة عم يلعب، زائد نقل روايات الشهداء الأطفال بأسمائهم فعلا، ورسخ عندهم معنى الشهادة، معنى المقاومة ومعنى الجنة، زائد انه رسخ اكثر الامكنه المرتبطه بذاكره مقاومه حزب الله مثل وادي الحجاير اللي اصدر عنها سلسله كمان روايات.
اوكي. So بقول بس هم they were late مهدي
دار المهدي.
ايه
دار المهدي.
اوكي. نشوفهم. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for this presentation. It warms my heart to see people who gathered material of both such a range of sources and with such historical depth. It's really rare. I have...
the man in front of you is his collection.
Thank you for archiving it. I have two comments. First is, I'd like to hear a bit more of your thoughts on some of the styles that the Arab nationalist regimes were using. If you see a relation to, say, like Soviet realism or socialist realism or what. The second comment is about this question of the effectiveness of propaganda, where we oftentimes we talk about it as though propaganda simply does things, especially to vulnerable populations like children, which is exactly what comic censors in the US in the 50s argued. Whereas we know from the historical record that, say, even in Nazi Germany, Goebbels ordered people at one point to lock cinema doors so that people wouldn't just get up and leave in the middle of films. That we can't judge the response of the audience, even of children, to be that which the regime wants. And to bring it back to the Arab world, I have in mind Lisa Wadeen's work on the Syrian Ba'ath ideology, which actually in a lot of cases is almost agnostic on whether or not it expects people to actually believe it. It just expects people to act as if they believe it. So I think maybe in our discussion about effectiveness.
Yes, I think there could be a very good discussion about effectiveness, particularly this audience who have grown up on these comics. I mean, I know that they have seen these comics, and I would like to ask them, as young people in the Arab world, how it affected them. Like the young man next to you, he's a Syrian comic artist, and next to him is a Syrian comic artist, also Samsung. So they can tell you how much the propaganda affected them. I think it would be very interesting to hear their opinion rather than mine. I can tell you, because I was not able to get a lot of material on, I mean, I did not make a study of the market and who's buying those. I know that Majid had up to 150,000, it was distributed around 150,000 in its heyday, but that was the highest magazine. So you're talking about much lower numbers. These numbers are 20, 10,000 people maybe. It's not, or even less. So I don't know enough about that. I think the audience would be great. And for the first question, I think it's very interesting. It depends on like exactly what you said. The Syrian, I mean, I grew up in a big part of my life in Syria, and I watched Lolik Ibolik and cartoons that were Russian and comics that was Russian, and so we had a lot of the influence. All the young Syrian artists were given scholarships to go to Eastern European countries or Russia, so the influence of that was very apparent in the work, I think. So you could see that, especially in, I look at quite a bit of the Iraqi, but mostly the Syrian. I think they have heavy, also in the colors, heavy Russian influences. It's matte, gray, brown kind of things. The same as their architecture, the big, bulky, you know, communist buildings that we grew up with. I would say that Iraq had much more Italian influence. I think for some reason they sent, it really depends, I think, on the scholarships at the time and the things that were happening, because it depends where they studied or what they did. The few lucky maybe didn't go to Russia only. I mean, I'm not saying anything about Russia, but it was just so heavily apparent. I can't say the same as about, because the Ba'athist ones, they had a very painterly, you had a lot of the, as I said, the famous artists were contributing to these magazines. So it wasn't very, some of the work wasn't very comicsy. It was painterly and in a sense it was very artistic. Not that comics isn't artistic, I'm just trying to say less cartoony. However, the Egyptian had a much more cartoony style that was primitive cartoons. They did not have the heavy influence. Lebanon had, I think, quite an influence of the Belgian school of comics and French, because of their also relationship to their colonizers. So I think one can see relating to, you know, who the association was with these countries and who was Britain, how much it affected Jordan and Egypt and other countries. Definitely, you can see the influence there. But I would say, to me, the Russian thing was very much more apparent. I think also you can ask some of the people who are Syrian comics artists. ما هيك التأثير الروسي قبل، عم بحكي قديم. كيف تلاقوا الألوان، الشكل كان متأثر، عم بحكي of course a long time ago. Now it's a good question. Now هلا خلينك بس now it's a good question because you have the internet and now everything is open. And so people have manga influences because of the Japanese and very, very random. So if I take a bunch of Syrian artists today, I can't say they have at all any Russian influences. Now it's very, very eclectic, very different. I'd say there are a lot of manga style a bit apparent, I think maybe because we grew up with some of the translated cartoons, Japanese cartoons and Grandizer and all those. But ما بعرف شو رأيكم بال
I think it was a political decision.
Yes.
That type of style more than
they wanted
to Russia or they went to
perhaps
it's the same their sculptures and their wall paintings, etc. as propaganda. So it was a political decision. That style
has to be there.
That was it, I think.
أي شيء اللي كان بيطلع على الضوء هو اللي بيأثر بهذا.
أي شيء بيطلع على الضوء، بس ما كان في أشياء كثير على الضوء من زمان. يعني كان كثير محدود شو عم بيوصل.
100%. بس رسمة الرئيس مثلا الحافظ الأسد نفس الرسمة اللي كان تقولي رسم إنه واقعي كان نفسه على الكوميك إنه يصير نفس الستايل بالكوميك.
The same, so she's saying that the portraits of the president, the same style was used in the comics. So the same, you know, drawing style that to draw the portrait of the president was used in the comics. So and what he said was that anything that came that was they could see affected them, but they were very limited. I mean, Syria really limited what their public saw for a long time. No comics were allowed except the Syrian state comics. And so, let's say, so the influences were less at that time. شو كنت عم تقول برمضان؟
عم بقول إنه يعني الشيء اللي كنا عم نشوفه على الضوء ما كان عندنا غير مجلة واحدة يمكن أو مجلتين يعني. فطبيعي انه تكون ما في غير ستايل واحد ومتاثر بشيء واحد وهو نفسه يعني كوبي بيست عن شيء.
في شيء نهار انتم قدرتوا تحصلوا على كوميكس من غير بلدان؟
اكيد.
ايه
يعني مثلا
عم بحكي انت صغير مش
ايه يعني مجلة العربي الصغير مثلا
العربي
الكويت، مجلة احمد اكيد، مجلات لبنان يعني مجلة ماجد.
ايه بس تنتان not in Syria for here. Was it sold؟ ايه المجلد تنتان هلا تذكرت ونزلت 70 80s. تنتان كان مجلد ما كان كتاب تنتان اللي هو كان مجلد عدة انواع مجلد.
حقيقة انه انا اتفق مع من ذكر بانه الدعاية اللي استخدمتها هذه المجلات لها تأثير سلبي. من الدراسات اللي طلعت عليها واللي حللت مضامين اكثر هذه المجلات. الحقيقة انا عندي ملاحظة اكثر مما هي سؤال. اعتقد او انه انا مقتنعة اكثر من اعتقادي انه دور هذه المجلات انحسر الان. واصبحت البرامج اللي تقدمها القنوات الفضائية المتخصصة بالطفل اكثر تأثيرا. تحمل في كثير من مضامينها دعاية اغلبها سلبي. بالنسبه مثلا بالعراق عندنا يعني قبل 2003 كانت مجله اللي انت عرفتي مجلتي والمزمار وكان توزيعها محدود جدا. بعد 2003 توقفت المجلتين.
انا عم بحكي على الايام الجميله بالسبعينات والثمانينات. بعدين انا عم بقول دهورت احوال هالمجلات لانه اللي عم يرسموا فيها بطلوا يعني
وبحكم انه
والحكومه صارت
لا وبحكم انه المطبوع او المقروء انحسر واصبح المرئي هو الاكثر.
صح.
يعني بالعراق عندنا يمكن الطفل العراقي يشاهد البرامج اللي تعرضها القنوات المتخصصه ما يقارب 6 أو 7 ساعات يوميا اذا مو اكثر. وبالتالي فتاثير هذه البرامج يكون اقل اكثر. احنا هسه بالعراق مجله واحده اسمها شمس تصدرها شبكه الاعلام العراقي توزع ما يقارب 8 أو 9,000 وهي ملحق لجريده الصباح. يعني هذه المجلات انحسرت. انا اتصور انه هذه المجلات
او لا
احنا توقفت. بالعراق توقفت موجوده.
مجلة موجودة
بس مو نفس
دار ثقافة الأطفال.
دار ثقافة الأطفال
يعني أصبحت شهرية ويعني هل توزع 100 نسخة؟ رأيك؟
لا أنا يعني أنا كثير مهم اللي عم بقوله إنه هذا الشيء كان موجود بالسبعينات مع وجود البعث وكان له تأثيره لأنه كان جزء من يعني الدولة وقتها كانت هيك يعني بقمة الناس اللي عم ترسم والدولة عم تعطي فندنج يعني عم تمويل عم تمول هالفنان. بعدين صار في تدهور بالحكومات بالرجيم يعني والدليل اللي صار بالعالم صح؟ ودهوروا المجلات مع هالاشياء. بس بالبداية كانوا قوايا وكانوا مهمين وكانوا الرسامين والكتاب كثير مهمين. بس أنا معك أكيد حيأثر. وهن ليش عم بيعملوا هالمجلات؟ لأنه بيأثروا. هن عم بيعملوا هيدا
طيب لا بعد معنا شيء 10 دقائق بس بنكمل اسئله. بس في كم شغله بدي اركز عليها بالنسبه ل التربيه من ناحيه التربيه العالميه. نحن قصدنا نحط محاضره عن الكوميكس مع انه صراحه اليوم بالديجيتال ايج الاطفال بشكل عام مش كثير عم يتقبلوا الموضوع. They have video games بالضبط. بالضبط ما هذا اللي بدي اقوله. البروباغندا بالاخر هي واحده. يعني كنا عم نحكي امبارح عن الاعلان عن الادفرتايزنج، كنا عم نحكي عن اخبار قبل هذا الموضوع. بالاخر البروباغندا هي نمط منظم من الاقناع وبيشتغل على اجيال، بيشتغل على فتره طويله. كاكاديميين وكاعلاميين اولا لازم نقدر نفهم كيف انتاجيه هيدي المواد ان كانت كوميكس او اي شيء ثاني وشو هي البروباغندا اللي بتدخل فيها. وكاكاديميين كيف نقدر ندرسها ونوعي طلابنا عليها من ناحيه الاهل يوعوا الاطفال عليها، لانه في جزء من التربيه الاعلاميه بيركز على الاطفال والبروباغندا الموجهه لهم. بدون شغله ثانيه، كلمه بروباغندا نحن اليوم بنستعملها بطريقه سلبيه، لكن هي لحد الحرب العالميه الثانيه او حتى الخمسينات والستينات هذه كانت كلمه كثير نيوترال. حتى في مينستر اوف بروباغندا، وزير البروباغندا، ده اللي بتستعمل ال60 وال70 حتى بالثمانينات كنت اشوف هذه الكلمه. احد مصادر اللي قريها بترد كلمه بروباغندا للكنيسه الكاثوليكيه، هدفها كان نشر الدين، بعث الدين، propagating the faith. هي بكل بساطه اذا بس بدنا ننظر لهيدي الاكاديميه حمله منظمه لاقناع بوجهه معينه. يعني اذا انتم كنتوا مؤيدين لهيدي الايديولوجيه، بالنسبه لكم اي واحد بيقتنع بهذه الايديولوجيه منها سلبيه. ممكن اللي ضد هذه الايديولوجيه تكون سلبيه له. اللي بيامن بايديولوجيه حزب الله او مبارك او صدام حسين او الاسد او اي شيء، بالنسبه له هيدا بيعبر عن ايديولوجيته وبيهمه يدفش هيدي الايديولوجيه باستخدام البروباغندا. في البروباغندا بمعنى اخر هي وسيله، لكن وسيله معقده، واليوم كثير صارت سوفيستيكيتد. ومع محاضره دكتور سعد شهري على 1:30 رح نشوف كيف الماكينه الاسرائيليه بامريكا بتوجه الاعلام باستخدام الامور اللي انتم بتعلموها، public relations PR، باستخدامها لاقناع الشعب الامريكي بوجهه النظر الاسرائيليه، مثل ما بسمي التايتل غسل ادمغتهم بشكل عام. بس مين كان معه
أنا سؤالي في سؤالي يمكن ليه علاقة بالتعليق اللي دكتور رجاد قاله، إنه البروباغندا هي عملية منظمة ومقصودة. فهل حضرتك بتعتقدي إنه صناع الكوميكس دي على مر العصور وباختلاف البلدان كانوا بيقصدوا توصيل هذه الرسائل، ولا هي في اللاوعي ونتيجة تأييدهم لفكر معين هي بتطلع معاهم كده؟ لأن هل في أجندة بتوجههم للشيء ده ولا لا؟
في الوعي طبعا في الوعي. وفي اجهزه بتقول لهم شو يقولوا وشو ما يقولوا وشو يرسموا وشو ما يرسموا.
ده علشان هم يعني كوميكس من جهات حكوميه او تمويل.
انا ما فرجيت توك توك مثلا، هي منا جهه منظمه عم تحاول تعطيكي وعي، عم تفرجي الحياه اليوميه، ما بفرجي الكوميكس من توك توك مثلا.
طيب السؤال الثاني له علاقه بانه زي ما احنا شفنا احيانا كتير بتبقى الكوميك دي في اوقات حرب او صراعات او ثورات، فاحنا يعني اعتقد ان احنا محتاجين دراسه متعمقه في انه يعني زي تحليل بياني للسنوات او في اوقات الصراع والذروه، هل هي بيقصدوا البروباغندا دي في اوقات معينه، والاوقات الثانيه اللي ما بيبقاش فيها صراع او فيها ثورات ازاي الكوميكس بتبقى بتتكلم عن ايه؟ عن الحياه يوميه ولا برضه بتحاول يبقى فيها ده؟
طبعا معك حق، وحلو واحد يعمل هالبحث، بس اكيد اكثر عن الحياه اليوميه. ومثل حضرتها عم تقلنا عن المهدي انه بعد 2006 بعد 2006 تغير شو المنهاج والاشياء اللي فرجوها بالكوميكس، يعني حتى يوعوا الناس، حتى يغيروا اتجاه تفكيرهم ولا لاي سبب كان. بس اكيد عنا سمير البدايه والحرب 73 بالعالم العربي، يعني بسوريا واسرائيل ضد سوريا ومصر، وال67 دائما كان في خلص بيصير كثير الكوميكس موجود وكله عن الحرب وعن المجاهد وعن السولجر رينو. اوكي هون هي 7 لا هي 80 هي 80 بس
ايران كانت العراق.
هيدي بال 77 بس بال 73 كان في هيدي بال 67 وهي 67 كمان. طبعا وقت الحرب بيزيدوا باتجاه ايش حصل بالحرب. اكيد انا بتصور انه الكل تعب وخلص كفينا. فكروا بموضوعكم
حتى القطع عليه هلال.